In the deep, crushing silence of the Libyan desert, where the horizon dissolves into a shimmering mirage of heat and nothingness, the war was supposed to be impossible. To the military strategists in Berlin and Rome, and indeed to many in London, the vast interior of North Africa was a natural barrier, more formidable than any minefield or fortification. It was a place where maps were blank, where temperatures swung from blistering 60-degree heat to freezing cold in a single cycle of the sun, and where the lack of water promised a slow, agonizing death to anyone foolish enough to venture far from the coast. Yet, in December 1943, a dossier landed on a desk at Wehrmacht intelligence headquarters in Berlin that shattered this assumption. The document, analyzed by the staff of Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, contained a stark admission regarding the Allied special operations that had plagued the Axis forces for years. It noted, with a mixture of professional frustration and grudging respect, that the long-range desert group played an extremely important part in the enemy sabotage operation. This was not merely a report on enemy troop movements. It was an acknowledgement that the German military machine, despite its technological prowess and tactical brilliance, had been outmaneuvered not by a massive army, but by a phantom force. These men, whom the Italians had initially dismissed as confused wanderers, had turned the empty quarter of the Sahara into a highway for destruction, guiding the SAS to targets deep in the rear and watching every movement of the Panzer Army Africa with invisible eyes. To understand the magnitude of what the long-range desert group achieved, one must look back to the desperate summer of June 1940, when the British position in the Mediterranean hung by a thread. Italy had declared war, bringing the full weight of its colonial ambitions to bear on North Africa. The numbers were terrifyingly lopsided. The Italian 10th Army in Libya boasted nearly 250,000 men, supported by nearly 2,000 aircraft and a supply chain that stretched comfortably along the paved coastal roads they controlled. Facing them, the British Western Desert Force in Egypt could muster only 36,000 men and a pitiful 200 aircraft. The strategic geography seemed to seal Britain's fate. The Italians held Libya, the British held a thin strip of Egypt, and between them lay 800 miles of what was assumed to be impassable wasteland. The Italians had every reason to feel secure in their dominance. They possessed the Auto-Saharan companies, eunuchs with 17 years of experience patrolling the edges of the desert. Operating from fortified oases like Kufra, they drove the Spavi Berti AS-42 Sahariana, a vehicle purpose-built for the terrain, featuring four-wheel steering and heavy armament. They had organic air support and a logistical network that should have made them the masters of the sand. But the Italians suffered from a fatal lack of imagination. They believed that to control the desert, one had to control the oases and the roads. They believed the deep desert, the sand seas with dunes the size of mountains, was a wall that protected their southern flank. Enter Major Ralph Aldra Bag. In a military establishment that prized conformity and adherence to the manual, Bagnold was a peculiar anomaly. A 53-year-old Royal Signals officer and a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, Bagnold had spent the decade prior to the war doing what professional soldiers considered madness, driving civilian vehicles into the heart of the Libyan desert for the sheer thrill of exploration. He and a small group of like-minded adventurers had mapped the discovering that with the right tire pressure, a heavy truck could float over soft sand, and that with a sun compass, one could navigate a sea of dunes as accurately as a ship at sea. When he walked into General Wavel's headquarters in Cairo, he didn't bring a standard military plan. He brought a radical concept born of scientific curiosity and amateur tinkering. He proposed a unit of pirates, a self-sufficient force that would ignore the coastal stalemate and strike from the deep desert, appearing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines to gather intelligence and sow chaos. Wavell, desperate for any advantage, gave Bagnold 6 weeks to make it happen. This decision would birth the long-range desert group, a unit that would prove that the most dangerous weapon in war is not always the biggest gun, but the most adaptable mind. Bagnold knew that the success of this venture depended entirely on the quality of the men. He didn't want standard infantrymen who needed orders to breathe. He needed men who could think. He needed mechanics who could fix a cracked engine block with sand and determination, navigators who could read the stars like Bedouin, and soldiers who could endure weeks of isolation without losing their discipline. He found exactly what he was looking for in the New Zealand division. When Bagnold asked for volunteers, the response was overwhelming. He selected 85 men, mostly farmers, who possessed a unique combination of stoicism and mechanical aptitude. These were men who had spent their lives fixing tractors on remote stations, men who were used to the silence of the high country and the necessity of They became the backbone of the LRDG, the initial patrols T and WWII, entirely Kiwi, their trucks bearing Maori names like Rotoma and Te Anel, their insignias featuring the tiki and the kiwi. It was a cultural infusion that defined that unit's character: egalitarian, practical, and utterly unimpressed by rank or ceremony. They were there to do a job, and that job was to survive where no one else could. The vehicles they chose were a slap in the face to conventional military wisdom, while the rest of the army clamored for four-wheel drive. Bagnold selected the Chevrolet 30 CWT, a standard two-wheel drive civilian truck. His reasoning was grounded in the hard physics of the desert. Four-wheel drive systems were heavy, complex, and fuel-hungry. In the deep desert, range was the only metric that mattered. A truck that could drive through mud was useless if it ran out of gas 300 miles from the nearest water well. The Chevrolets, stripped of their doors, roofs, and windshields to save weight and improve cooling, could achieve 12 miles per gallon. With their massive payloads of fuel, water, and ammunition, they had a range of 1,100 miles. This meant an LRDG patrol could travel 500 miles inland, observe the enemy for days, and return without ever needing resupply. Later experiments with Ford four-wheel drive trucks proved Bagnold right. The Fords guzzled fuel at twice the rate of the Chevys, effectively having their operational radius. The LRDG mechanics turned these civilian trucks into weapons of war, fitting them with condenser systems to recapture boiling radiator water, a critical innovation in a land where water was more precious than gold. They reinforced the springs, added wide sand tires, and mounted an arsenal of weaponry that turned each truck into a prickly porcupine of machine guns. A single patrol carried enough firepower to level a town. Lewis guns, Vickers heavy machine guns, Boys anti-tank rifles, and Breda autocannons captured from the Italians. But firepower was secondary to the LRDG's primary weapon: navigation. The Italians and Germans were tethered to the known world by their reliance on maps and magnetic compasses. In the desert, magnetic compasses were often rendered useless by the magnetic interference of the vehicle's own metal, or by iron or deposits in the rocks. Furthermore, there were no landmarks to take bearings from, just an endless, shifting ocean of sand. Bagnold introduced the sun compass, a simple yet brilliant device that used the shadow of a pin to determine true north based on the time of day. It allowed the LRDG to navigate on the move, maintaining a precise heading across hundreds of miles of featureless terrain. At night, they used theodolites to take star shots, fixing their position with the accuracy of a naval surveyor. This scientific approach to warfare allowed them to move through the fourth dimension that so baffled the enemy. They could vanish into the empty quarters where the Axis commanders believed no human could survive, only to reappear hundreds of miles away, behind the front lines, striking with sudden and terrifying violence. The impact on the Italian forces was psychological as much as it was physical. For the first year of the war, the Italians were chasing ghosts. Patrols would report British vehicles deep in the interior, contradicting intelligence that placed the enemy safely on the coast. General Graziani, the Italian commander, found himself paralyzed by the uncertainty. He halted his massive army for months, fearing a flanking attack from a force that, in reality, consisted of a few dozen men in beat-up trucks. The LRDG had achieved strategic paralysis through the projection of threat. They were the masters of the bluff, using the vastness of the desert to magnify their strength. When the Germans arrived in early 1941, bringing the professional rigor of the Afrika Korps, they did not make the mistake of underestimating these raiders. German intelligence reports from the era are devoid of the dismissal that characterized the early Italian response. They recognized the LRDG as a serious threat to their supply lines and rear areas. The Germans even went so far as to create their own special units to counter them, recruiting men like Count Laszlo Almasi, a pre-war colleague of Bagnold's, to lead deep penetration missions. But the Germans, for all their efficiency, never quite mastered the art of the long-range patrol in the way the LRDG did. Their units were always tethered to the operational needs of the front line, whereas the LRDG operated with a strategic autonomy that was unique in the theater. The true destructive potential of the LRDG was realized when they partnered with a young, audacious Scotsman named David Stirling and his nascent Special Air Service. Stirling's initial idea of parachuting men behind enemy lines had been a disastrous failure, resulting in the loss of a third of his unit to the desert elements. He realized that the problem wasn't the target, it was the delivery method. The LRDG became the Libyan Desert Taxi Service, the ferryman who carried the SAS commandos to the doorstep of the enemy airfields. It was a perfect symbiosis. The LRDG provided the navigation and the ride. The SAS provided the demolition experts and the close quarters violence. In December 1941, this partnership unleashed hell on the Axis air power. In a single month, navigating through storms and across terrain that broke lesser vehicles, LRDG patrols delivered SAS teams to airfields at Tamat, Sirte, El Agheila, and Aj. The results were staggering. 151 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, along with fuel dumps and supply convoys. To put this in perspective, a conventional bombing raid by the RAF might risk dozens of heavy bombers and hundreds of crewmen to destroy a handful of enemy planes, often with heavy losses. The LRDG and SAS, operating with fewer than 50 men, had wiped out the equivalent of several squadrons without suffering a single casualty during the transport phase. It was an efficiency of violence that had no parallel in the history of warfare. Yet, for all the glamour of the raids and the exploding aircraft, the LRDG's most significant contribution to the Allied victory was a silent, tedious, and nerve-wracking operation known as the Road Watch. As the war in North Africa swung back and forth like a pendulum, General Montgomery, preparing for the decisive battle at El Alamein, needed to know exactly what the Desert Fox Rommel had in his reserves. Aerial reconnaissance was spotty and could be deceived by camouflage. Montgomery needed eyes on the ground. The LRDG established a surveillance post at the Marble Arch, a monument on the main coastal highway deep behind enemy lines. For months, lying in the scrub just a few hundred yards from the road, LRDG troopers watched. They counted every tank, every truck, every fuel bowser that moved toward the front. They identified unit insignias and verified the arrival of the Tiger tanks. This intelligence was radioed back to Cairo, giving Montgomery a complete picture of the enemy's order of battle. It was a mission of supreme discipline. One cough, one glint of sunlight on a binocular lens, and they would be discovered and killed. Yet, from March to July 1942, they maintained this watch without losing a single man or vehicle. The intelligence they gathered was pivotal. It allowed Montgomery to plan his offensive with the certainty of a card player who can see his opponent's hand. When the 8th Army finally broke the Axis line at El Alamein, the victory was built on the foundation of those silent hours spent lying in the dust. By the Marble Arch. The operational history of the LRDG is a testament to the power of adaptation. They were a unit that constantly evolved. When the Luftwaffe began to hunt them with dedicated aircraft, they painted their trucks in garish pink and yellow schemes that counterintuitively blended perfectly with the desert haze at dawn and dusk. When the Italians upgraded their defenses, the LRDG upgraded their weaponry, mounting heavier guns and developing new tactics for shooting on the move. They were also a melting pot of the British Empire. While the New Zealanders were the founding fathers, the unit eventually included Rhodesians, British Guardsmen, and Yeomanry. The Rhodesians of S Patrol proved to be natural bushmen, adapting their skills from the African veldt to the Libyan sands. They even used the Shona language for radio communications, baffling German interceptors who could not break a code based on a language they didn't know existed. This diversity was a strength, bringing together different perspectives and skills, united by a common purpose, to be the masters of the desert. However, the story of the LRDG is not without its tragedies. As the war in Africa drew to a close, and the fighting moved to the jagged islands of the Aegean and the mountains of Italy, the LRDG found themselves stripped of their greatest advantage, the desert itself. They were transformed from masters of the open sands into infantry commandos fighting in terrain that did not suit their specialized skills. The disastrous Battle of Leros in November 1943 saw the unit suffer catastrophic losses. The New Zealand government, seeing the decimated ranks of its squadron, requested their withdrawal. It was a bitter end to the classic era of the LRDG. The unit that had roamed thousands of miles of desert with impunity was ground down in the brutal, claustrophobic fighting of the Mediterranean theater. Yet, even in these dark days, the spirit of the unit remained. Men like Trooper Ronald Moore, who walked 200 miles through the desert with a shattered foot and no water to reach safety, exemplified the indomitable will that Bagnold had looked for back in 1940. The legacy of the long-range desert group echoes loudly in the special forces of today. The concepts they pioneered, the self-sufficient vehicle patrol, the insertion of specialist teams behind enemy lines, the use of indigenous environments as a weapon are now standard doctrine for units like the SAS, the U.S. Navy SEALs, and the Delta Force. David Lloyd Owen, who rose from a patrol commander to become a major general, took the lessons of the LRDG and applied them to the conflicts of the post-war era, proving that the principles of small unit leadership and adaptability are timeless. The Pink Panthers, the Land Rovers used by the SAS in the deserts of Oman and Iraq decades later, were the direct spiritual descendants of Bagnold. The LRDG proved that a small group of determined, intelligent men, operating with autonomy and trusting in their own skills, could achieve strategic results that defied the mathematics of conventional warfare. In the final analysis, the comparison between the LRDG and their Axis counterparts reveals the fundamental difference between the combatants. The Italians had the experience, the forts, and the purpose-built vehicles, but they lacked the doctrine of offense. They used their desert units to guard the perimeter, to look inward. The Germans had the tactical brilliance and the discipline, but they viewed the desert as a theater to be endured, a logistical hurdle to be overcome on the way to the Suez Canal. The LRDG, and by extension the British command that sanctioned them, viewed the desert as an ocean to be sailed. They embraced the hostility of the environment, turning the heat and the distance into allies. They understood that in a war of machines, the most critical component is the human element, the ability to innovate, to endure, and to outthink the enemy. Field Marshal Rommel's admission that the LRDG caused more damage than any other unit of equal strength is the ultimate epitaph for the unit. It is a recognition that war is not always decided by the heaviest battalions, but by the sharpest blades. The 350 volunteers who rode their battered trucks into the great sand seas did not just destroy aircraft and supply dumps. They destroyed the enemy's sense of security. They proved that no front line is impenetrable, that no rear area is safe, and that with enough courage and ingenuity, the impossible becomes merely a logistical problem to be solved. From the dusty streets of Cairo to the marble halls of the Wehrmacht intelligence headquarters, the legend of the Ghost Patrol serves as a reminder that in the vast chess game of war, the pawns that can move like knights are the ones that checkmate kings. The LRDG remains a singular example of military excellence, a fusion of science, grit, and audacity that has rarely been equaled and never surpassed. They were, in every sense, the navigators of a new kind of warfare, leaving tracks in the sand that the winds of history have failed to erase.